I'm Dr. Duke with The New American, and I want to wish everybody out there a very Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and the very best blessings of the Christmas season. I want to dedicate my commentary time today to talking about Christmas. I know a lot of people are, and there are a lot of takes, but I think this is a good one. It's a basic one. It's getting back to the basics of Christmas. We all know that Christmas has become too commercialized. I am really blown away by the fact that at the end of September, sometimes in mid-October, you are already getting Christmas decorations in some of our department stores, advertisements for Christmas buying and shopping and selling. Certainly by the time well before Thanksgiving gets here, we're already decorating for Christmas holidays. And of course, as you and I know, that isn't really the Christmas message. What I want to talk to you about is the fundamental message of Christmas, which is the Incarnation. Let's just stop for a moment and think about what this means. What does it mean that we as Christians believe that the God who created the universe, that God who is completely transcendent without a body, that God who exists outside the realm of his world, is not trapped in it, as pagan philosophy would argue. Our God is not a God of rocks or trees or the sky or the sea. This is a God who completely transcends material reality, the material prison house that sin and death have bequeathed to us. No, this is a transcendent God. For that transcendent God to be so concerned for the world and his people in the world that he would literally squeeze himself into a human body. Contemplate for a moment. This is what the Incarnation is. This is what we celebrate on Christmas. The idea that God became man. It seems to me that from a purely theological and philosophical point of view, a tremendously non-material, universal, omniscient, omnipotent God who decides to enter his material world as a human baby, a flesh and blood child, and not a king, not an emperor with armies, not a rich man, not a philosopher king, but as a slave child to the Roman Empire. The Jews had been subjected by the Romans. He was born a slave child with no money, no power, no armies. The King of Kings was born in a manger. So it's not just that God becomes man, but that God chooses to become man in perhaps the most lowly form possible. Would that not theologically and philosophically, would that not simple incarnation have been enough possibly to save the world? That God now knows what it's like to be man, to suffer, to sweat in the summer and to shiver in the cold, to feel the sting of bodily necessity, to suffer through diseases and sicknesses and viruses, to be very human, to be fully human. But the Incarnation is about much more than that. The Incarnation is not only did God enter the world that he created and subordinated himself to flesh and blood and to the imperatives of flesh and blood that we all suffer, but he also exposed himself to death. That's the second great mystery of Christianity, which could not have existed had it not been for the Incarnation, the infleshing of divine spirit into human form. There is no mystery like that in any of the world's religions. There is nothing quite like this kind of incarnation. Surely in Greek and Roman mythology and most of the world's pagan mythologies, gods would take on animal forms, gods would take on human forms, but it's not the same thing. This is what we call, besides the Incarnation, another word for this in theological sense is the hypostatic union. Right? The absolute union between pure spirit and physical flesh that goes way beyond the stories of Greek and Roman gods disguising themselves as bulls or as swans to seduce women. This was an actual hypostatic union in which fully human and fully divine, this creature, this God who made the universe, experiences life through our sensory ability. He enters materialism as a material creature to preach ascendance above materialism. What is the great incarnation message of Christmas? And why was Christ born? Why was the God who made the universe born so poor? To remind us, I think, that Christmas is and has always been the holiday for the suffering, the holiday for the forgotten, the holiday for the sick, the holiday for the weak, the lost, the despairing. Think about what Christmas is, right? It offers hope. It was to the shepherds, not just the magi, the kings, but the kings got to see a star, the three wise men. They got to follow a star from the Orient to worship at the manger of the Christ child. but it was the shepherds, the lowly shepherds living, abiding by their flocks at night. They were the ones, not the magi, who were saluted by the angel, right, on that beautiful Christmas morning. They were the ones who were greeted by the choiring angels about the redemption and the salvation of the Lord and how it's now been brought about. From the very beginning, religion, the Incarnation, wasn't about majesty and kingness. It was about announcing the good news, which would become the Gospels, announcing the good news of the God who took on human flesh. It's a beautiful story. And if we remember that, right, we remember that. Doesn't mean you can't have your Santa Claus and your Christmas trees, none of which, by the way, have a lick to do with Christmas as we understand the Incarnation, and your presents and all the other things, the other fanfare that comes with Christmas. Look, if there was ever an event in human history to be celebrated, it is this one. The God who made the universe entering that universe as a child, as a flesh and blood human being. That is worth your celebrations. But don't lose sight of what the celebrations are for. And we go back to this idea of the Incarnation. There's a great professor of English linguistics down at the University of Washington University of Washington in Missouri, a very St. Louis, one of those private schools in Missouri. A priest by the name of Father Walter Ong, O-N-G, very famous man, one of the world's great linguists. He was once approached by a reporter, a secular reporter, who saw him primarily as a professor, not really as a priest. He wore a collar, but this man is one of the world's foremost intellectuals. This reporter sat down with Father Ong and asked him off the cuff, Professor Ong, what do you consider to be the single greatest importance in the history of human development? And Ong looked at him like he was kind of crazy, not having to remind this reporter that he was actually a priest. And he said, why the Incarnation, of course. And it's a brilliant statement by Father Ong. Yes. There can be no more significant event in human history than the entering of the world he made by the God who created it. There's a great poem by the World War I poem, Edward Shillitoe. It's called Jesus of the Scars. And it's one of my favorite poems. This is a young man, as so many of that generation of World War I young men who were killed, went to war, saw the suffering and the degradation of really what was the first great mechanistic war, right? World War I was the first real anonymously killing war, right? It wasn't hand-to-hand combat. It wasn't men on horseback or men facing off hand-to-hand. Really the first great war in which bombs fell from the sky and mustard gas and you had trenches and tanks and all of those things. It was mechanistic murder. Like many of the young men of his age, Shillitoe had become very attuned to the suffering of humanity through those wars. And he wrote a poem called Jesus of the Scars, which points out something really unique about the Incarnation. Of all the gods that ever were and perhaps ever will be, Christ is the one. Christ is the one who actually suffers what we suffer. He knows what it is to die. He knows what it is to be tormented and tortured. He knows what it is to feel extreme abandonment. Father, why have you forsaken me? He knows what it's like to feel the wounds and to bleed every last drop of his precious blood for the life of his creatures. And Edward Shillitoe wrote, "The other gods were strong, but you were weak. They rode in splendor to a throne, but you stumbled under the weight of a cross. But only God's wounds to our wounds can speak, and not a God has wounds, but thou alone." And those last two sentences, I think, sum up something very, very unique about the Christian Incarnation. Only God's wounds have the authority to speak to our wounds. Only a God who suffered what we've suffered has the moral authority to tell us to endure suffering and to teach us how to overcome it. Only a God who knows what suffering is, not by intellect, but by experience. That's a God who has the authority and the experience to help us through our inevitable suffering in this world. The other gods were strong, but you were weak, right? And that's the key here. Right? Why the humility of Christ? And finally, only your wounds, but only your wounds can speak to our wounds. And not a God has wounds, but thou alone. And those wounds could only have been possible. The ability to empathize with human suffering could only have been possible thanks to the Incarnation. That moment when the creator of the universe entered the universe and Christmas Day, what would become Christmas Day, to the salvation and the joy of all of us, not just those angels caroling in the sky. I'm Dr. Duke, and this is my take on Christmas.